Hi there, everyone. Let's do our next lecture. We're talking about money in a really big scale, talking about global funding of things. And the key players with that are the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and more recently there's the G20, which is the 20 largest economies in the world, and they discuss things like monetary policy. So here we go. So I'd like to start with this just to give you an idea about markets, right? So this is developed and emerging gross domestic products from 1950 to 2050. And, I've shown you this before, but I just want to remind you of this about the increase that we're seeing here in China, right? That their GDP will be growing. It's estimated that in the U.S. it's going to be declining slightly, but then you'll also see India growing, Brazil growing. And so generally what this is showing you is that the lesser developed countries will be growing more, and that the more developed countries will be declining. So we'll see if that's going to work out to be true or not. These are the estimates, okay? So, one of the questions really is about, in terms of global monetary institutions, what are their goals? Is it to balance money and the environment, concerns about the environment? Is it simply to maximize profit for those that provide the money? Is it to create opportunity, meaning businesses and that type of thing? Is it to maintain capitalism? We had a big discussion about capitalism in our previous lecture. Is it to reduce poverty? Is it to move us towards environmental sustainability? So with all this, what I like to just caution you about is know that there's a lot of words out there, and you get a lot of people and institutions that will say things, but the bottom line is that the actions will always speak louder than the words. What exactly do they do? So really what we're on here is a post-World War II economic journey. After World War II, there was a meeting at what was called Bretton Woods, the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, and it was there that they created the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And the general idea there, and we'll have a more specific lecture on this later, was generally to connect the world's economies, and by doing that would reduce the threat of war. So I'm not going to get into a big long discussion about World War II, but we know that after World War I, requiring Germany to pay reparations caused a lot of problems, and that these problems end up leading to World War II. Of course, there was much more to this, but that is the economic component. So the questions then is that will the World Bank and will the International Monetary Fund be effective to move us from that era of colonialism and political and military influences over lesser developed countries? Or will there be a new type of political and military control, or even economic control? And there's this great book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and I really enjoyed it. And it basically talked about how the U.S. had used economic controls over countries. So that led to what is this other term. It's called neo-colonialism, meaning that in the old days you would have countries that would come in and take over an area, then they would become colonized. So the United States was colonized by England. You had basically all of Africa, all of South America, most, if not all of, or most of Asia was under the economic control of Europeans. That was known as colonialism. So after World War I, many of those countries got their freedom again, and yet others were still under the control of countries, and it started to move from military control to economic control, and that's where we have this term neo-colonization. So will we be moving from that so that countries can have control over themselves? Or are we moving into a new era where it's not really countries that have control over other countries, whether it be military or economic, but will it be controlled by corporations over countries? And that seems to be playing out currently. So we have to then ask, what's the role of these lending institutions, and will sustainability even be considered? And will efforts to free countries from debt, will that be a consideration? And if it does, are we going to move towards social harmony? Are we going to be promoting environmental quality? So the World Bank begins operations in June 25th of 1946. So the conference is in 1944. A couple of years later, the operations begin. And the World Bank has always been led by an American, and the International Monetary Fund has usually been led by a European. Both of these are located in the United States, and they each have 189 members. And that's because you have to join one organization to be part of the other. More on that in just a bit. So the purposes of the World Bank and the IMF is to lend money or grant money. Grant is when you give money not expecting something in return. Lend, you do expect a return on your investment. And the idea behind these then is economic growth. So the idea, going a little bit deeper, is to create self-sustaining prosperity, replacing debt. Debt would be money that one country owes another. And it's pointed out that for many countries, when they have debt, they begin to liquefy assets in order to pay off the debt. And what do you suppose many of the assets are? Well, they are resources in the environment. So debt actually ends up causing destruction of the environment, merely to pay off debt, which is primarily to the MDCs, who are also reaping the benefits of extracting resources from the environment of the LDCs. So there's more information on this, and it's easy to find it from the World Bank org. You can go look at their website. So the assumptions here is that global trade, these are the assumptions by the World Bank and the IMF, is that global trade will promote capitalism, that capitalism accelerates economic growth, and that economic growth that's brought about by capitalism will promote democracy. So, and then the next step is that democracy will promote human rights, and that democracy and capitalism together reduce poverty. These are assumptions. So one of the problems that can happen with this is if corporations begin to control democracy, and then we already know that they influence or they control capitalism. So my opinion is that the key element here is the role of corporations and how they will be managed. And what I mean by managed is not necessarily by themselves, but by government, because it's only governments that can control what a corporation can and cannot do. So let's talk a little bit about environmental protection. So in the United States, it's very easy for most of us to overlook the incredible benefits we have of living in this country. So in the U.S., we enacted many environmental laws to protect the public, many of them in the late 1960s, more so in the 1970s. We're looking at, we're at about at the 50-year anniversary here now of Earth Day. So in 1970 is when that happened. And right after Earth Day, then we began to have these environmental laws. Things like the Clean Air Act, which has been updated many times, the Water Quality Act, the National Environmental Protection Act. This is what required environmental impact reports. And then there was the Solid Waste Disposal Act, meaning we had to have places in how we manage the things that we throw away. So a lot of this stuff is all about the externalities of business. And what I mean by that is that when business produces a good, they produce oftentimes pollution, water pollution, air pollution, and when their materials are thrown away, you have that municipal solid waste. So all of those things are things that industry typically has not had to pay for. So when you internalize that externality, they then have to pay for reducing air pollution and water pollution and the materials that become municipal solid waste. So we've done a pretty good job in reducing air pollution and water pollution. Federal laws have come into place, and then there are state laws, and there oftentimes can also be regional laws that have influenced this. But the one thing that we are still far from achieving is managing municipal solid waste that's created by industry. So they make the product, they make the packaging, you and I pay for it, and then when we throw it away, you and I pay for that again, and we pay for, oftentimes when there's not a recycling market, we have to pay for that as well. So we still have room for improvement. All right, so international pollution issues, right? Human rights, remember, are not the same that we have, and different political systems have different rules, right? And there are fewer environmental protections, particularly in lesser developed countries. And one of the issues then with international trade organizations is are they going to take up new regulations, new requirements that they will then place upon industry to reduce their impacts. So the idea here is that when you have rules and regulations, you reduce the possibility of a tragedy of the commons. So a tragedy of the commons basically says that when anyone acts, a person or basically an organization or a system acts in their self-interest, that by pursuing and only pursuing that self-interest will eventually overload the system. And when you overload the system, the entire system collapses. And when the system collapses, it brings everyone and everything down with it. This diagram that you're seeing here is saying that if people can have as many sheep as they want on a particular plot of land, eventually the land can no longer support the sheep. So then you can no longer graze sheep, which means the herder has no means to produce more sheep or the products that come from sheep. And so now not only is the environment destroyed, but so is the economic opportunities that came with it. So the question is then, are we going to make choices to achieve economic growth, social sustainability, and environmental sustainability? We have an opportunity here to make choices. And so is the World Bank considering this? Is the International Monetary Fund thinking about this when we're looking at globalization? So here's the location of the World Bank. It's in Washington, D.C. Here's their logo down there. And their stated goal is to reduce poverty. Their primary function is to lend money to improve or build infrastructure, or we could also call that capital. So that would be highways, electric systems, dams, water systems, sewage systems, things like that. So when you provide those things, you can immediately provide jobs in the short term, and in the long term you could reduce pollutants and you can create economic activity. The first World Bank loan was after the Second World War, and was money to France, $250 million. Excuse me, just taking a swallow of coffee there. So the World Bank is technically part of the United Nations, so it's good to know that you have the world's countries that are involved, and the decision-making authority is divided amongst countries, and it basically is led to matched with the amount of money that countries provide to the World Bank. So the United States is the largest component at 16.4%. Then you have Japan at almost 8%, Germany at 4.5%, the UK at 4.3%, then France. So the bank's charter requires an 85% supermajority to approve something. And so what that basically means is that the United States is in this superior position, and they can block pretty much any change that it doesn't like, or if it doesn't like if somebody wants to change the governing structure of the bank, it's very difficult to do without having the United States on board. So the U.S. is extraordinarily important with this. And what that means is it's also extremely important who we elect as president, because they can influence how we decide to operate this global lending institution and what the goals should be. So the World Bank has many components to it. I've listed them all here for you. Might seem a little confusing. Remember, don't worry, there's no exam where you have to know all this stuff. This is here for your learning and your education and your awareness. That doesn't mean don't consider all this stuff, but you need to know it for other things that may come up in papers and things like that. I should say 189 countries. There we go. And we know that it's in Washington, D.C., about 10,000 employees. Maybe one of them will be you someday. Here's some figures here about how much money they lent in 2019. And the reason why I have elected here, in terms of the president being elected, is that it's always been a member of the United States who's led the World Bank. So the International Monetary Fund, here's their location here, a picture of their building. They monitor global lending and lending institutions, and their job is to stabilize the international monetary system. And they monitor the world's currencies to see how things are going, and then deciding if they should need to step in to affect all the value of world's currencies. And there's their logo here. So you could say that they have complementary missions, meaning one supports the other. The IMF stabilizes the monetary system, acts as this monitor, keeps track of the global economy, and the World Bank then works with developing countries to reduce poverty, and this concept of increasing shared prosperity. So they provide the financing and policy advice and technical assistance to other governments. And remember, some of these governments are very poorly run. They don't have people who really understand money and goals and how to achieve them. They don't have the technical experience. And so part of the idea of the World Bank is to provide them with that assistance as well. Oh, and then keep in mind that in order to be part of the World Bank, you also have to be part of the IMF. So countries are members of both. Now, there was a thing called the G8, and it was replaced with the G20. So what the G8 was, it was the Global 8 was the leading economic countries of the time. And they basically discussed promoting international or policy to promote financial stability. In 2009, it was increased from 8 to 20 countries, plus the European Union, which spoke as one. And then other people who attended this were people from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The G20's been criticized for being supportive of neo-colonization, that it's worked towards undermining local democracy and worker protections and weakening environmental protection. Well, that may or may not be true. There's different perspectives on this, and I'm not here to take a position on one or the other, but I want you to be aware of the criticism. So here's some of the components of the World Bank. This is the International Development Association, or the IDA. Started back in the Eisenhower administration. That even goes back to when I was born, the Eisenhower administration. And their goal is to decrease global poverty through increased economic growth. So what's key for you to understand here is that the idea is reducing global poverty by increasing economic prosperity. So there are credit terms when the IDA lends money. There's information that's listed here for you. And they tend to target human development projects to improve things like education, health, social safety, provide social safety nets,
water supply, sanitation, and you can see some examples here if you'd like to read those over. And the World Bank staff will assess the quality of each borrower's policy performance. That basically means how well are they managing their economics and their policies for inclusion and other components. So let's get down to, as I was talking about earlier, is like, well, countries or organizations may say one thing, but the bottom line is like, well, show me the proof. What are they doing? So that's what I have here. Is like, well, show me the money, right? Where do the funds come from, right? Who's providing the money to lend, and really what are their interest in this? So countries then, the World Bank makes money by selling bonds in the world's financial markets. So that might mean that you or your parents or some stockholder also owns some bonds, and so you may actually hold debt from a foreign country, and so when a country is paying back that loan, you're the person who's making money on that thing. So they also have reserves that's been built over years, and they have money that comes from the bank's member country shareholders, so that's from the governments themselves. And then they have income that's just repayment of loan principal. So that when you have a loan, you have principal and interest. So the principal is the amount of money that was lent, right? The interest is the money that you charge for lending the money. Hopefully you don't owe much, and you probably know if you look at your credit card statement, you've got this huge amount of interest that you're paying on the principal. So you see what's happening there. So this happens with other countries, except they don't charge nearly the amount that the credit card companies are charging you. My advice to you is if you don't need it, don't buy it, and stay away from those credit cards. Okay, so where does this money go? So it goes to countries for goods, labor, services, and support of these economic and social development projects, all of which have to be spelled out in any application, and oftentimes some quick financing to support some policy or institutional reforms. So you have to have the countries with money that like the ideas of that lesser developed countries want to do. So that might mean building a road from an industrial area to a port, so they have access to trade. And then there's grants to relieve debt burden, and these other things that you see listed here. So here's a list of these countries that are eligible for the money, right? See this whole bunch of them, over 760 countries that are eligible. But who gets most of it? Well, you can see here, Peru, India, China, strangely enough, for many, since they have the world's second largest economy, soon to surpass the United States. Then you have Indonesia, which is one of the top 5 populated areas in the world. Ukraine, which is interesting because they've been at war with Russia. I should say that Russia's been at war with them. Then you have Egypt, which has been in poverty for decades. Iraq, which we've had a war related to them. And then you have Poland, which is important because they're such a large country coming out of Eastern Europe, and trying to get their economy rolling after it has left after the Berlin Wall came down, and the whole change from communist system to capitalist system, which actually was led by the Polish people. Then you have Colombia, which has been racked by problems of drugs and drug issues there, in Kazakhstan. And then so these are the things that they've been funding, right? Water and sanitation, you can see here 9%. Transportation, social protection, public administration, 20%. So you have to have people who can manage the funds. Communications, fairly low here. Agriculture, education, energy, and you see finance fairly large at 12%. And the largest part of this is industry, trade, and services, interesting enough to know. So there's also loans that go to the heavily indebted poor countries, and they call that HIPC, HIPC, and it was launched in '96 and trying to work with very poor countries, making sure that they don't get a debt that they can't manage. The program's been revised, and it was revised to meet the Millennium Development Goals, not to be confused with the the Millennium Falcon, right? Don't get those two things confused. So debt burden, right? The idea is to work with debt burden, free some of these countries from debt. So there's a process about how they get assistance. I've listed some of those things out here for you. And then there's a second part. They're all here as well. I won't get into detail on that, but there you go. The idea of debt relief is that it frees up resources for social spending. So you can spend money on other things as opposed to just paying it on interest. And you could also reduce the destruction of your own country's resources because you don't have to destroy as much in order to raise revenue so you can pay off loans to richer countries. So that's the idea here. So these 5 factors for economic and business growth is building capacity, infrastructure creation, development of finance systems, to combat corruption, extraordinarily serious issue around the world, and then some research and consultancy and training. So let's talk about these Millennial Development Goals. It's 8 goals that all members of the United Nations agreed to try to achieve by the year 2015. Have they been met? No. Are we getting closer? Yes. So the idea was to commit the world's leaders to combat poverty, hunger, disease, illiteracy, environmental degradation, and discrimination against women. Developing countries then had some goals there was goals that were created by the World Bank for them to try to achieve this. So you have to have measurable goals. If you can't measure it, you don't know if you're going to be making it. And then the economic growth was expected to. Sorry about that. Let me fix that part there. Done. Promote economic growth through investment. So as we talked about earlier, that's the idea. Help them become more economically sustainable. So the current focus of lending from the World Bank is to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. And much of that money goes to what they call the middle income countries. And the loans come with very little or no interest at all. So that sounds like a good thing. So to achieve these goals, the World Bank's identified the 6 criteria: stronger growth, more inclusive growth, in particular in Africa, more effort in health and education, integrating development and environment, more aid and better aid, movement on trade negotiations. In other words, they want to improve global trade through better trade negotiations, and then more support from organizations like the World Bank. All right. So here are some of these goals about how are we going to meet them and what's happening. So the first here about eradicating extreme poverty and hunger. As you know from a recent assignment, there's been a huge drop in the number of people living in poverty. So it's been quite successful with this. So the proportion of people living in extreme poverty has dropped significantly, and this Now, these results, of course, they vary from country to country. In some areas like sub-Saharan Africa, that's where the problem is the worst. It hasn't seen as much improvement. And China, on the other hand, has been this massive improvement. They've moved nearly as many people out of poverty as there are the number of people that live in the United States. It's just absolutely astonishing, the improvement that happened there. So Africa, poverty in Africa is expected to continue to rise as we continue to try to work with African political people to resolve the issues that are happening there. And again, most of the undernourished children live in Africa. Less than a quarter of the countries are on track for achieving the goal of cutting in half the number of people in undernutrition. So, are we moving in the right direction? Yes. Should we be moving there faster? Yes, we should. Other ideas about meeting the Millennium Development Goals is achieving universal primary education, increasing the number of children that are in school in developing countries. And the good news is that has increased in recent years. In terms of promoting gender equality and empowering women, it's slower because there are major cultural issues that need to be resolved. But the idea is simply to provide some economic opportunities and empowerment for women, and that's the idea, to increase gender equality from them. Reducing child mortality. This is basically the number of children or percentage of children who die when they're under the age of 5. So we know that most of these children who die that are under the age of 5 die from preventable causes, and the way you can solve this problem is to provide cleaner air and water, reducing air pollutants, water pollutants, improving the quality of food, and some fundamental medicines, and then maternal health as well, providing health for pregnant women. Other things, that they've been trying to work with is combating HIV and AIDS, malaria. Malaria is a significant problem, and the number of HIV infections and AIDS has fallen, so that's good news. In terms of environmental sustainability, deforestation is still a problem, mostly because areas are cleared for agriculture, and then agricultural products being sold on the global market. And we have the problem of greenhouse gases emissions that are increasing faster than the advancement of energy technology to reduce them. So one of the problems is that we are not really moving closer to environmental sustainability, but actually going the other direction. Developing a global partnership for development. It's about having donor countries increasing or continuing to meet their pledges to support economic development. So the financing issues are taken into consideration by the World Bank. They want to know about, they look at things like inflation and the amount of capital that a country has, and what they can import and export, and what their debt is, what the outlook is. It's not a whole lot different than when a bank will consider, if they want to lend to you, the same thing about risk and cost and services. So what about property rights and government decentralization? The World Bank is pursuing this creation of clear ownership that happened in the area of property rights. So the idea is to provide more private citizens access to credit, because you need credit in order to create a business, and yet you have to understand that the World Bank does not loan money to people, but it lends money to countries. So then that's the country then who might have that money to then loan to people, right? Is that clear? From the World Bank to countries, countries to people. And so they're also looking at then decentralizing the power of governments by creating economic base for local areas. So so you move power from government to smaller areas, or in particular people running businesses. And then lastly with that is provide access to global markets so that you can have small businesses that are creating things and then they can sell them on the global market. You can find some of these products, by the way, at I saw them on Amazon has a special section on their website for this type of goods. I also saw a display at Costco, where they were selling global goods. I don't know if they're still doing that or not, but I'd seen that a year or so ago. So from the 1940s to the 70s, most of these loans were projects about reducing negative impacts from the World War II, and they were largely criticized for promoting neo-colonization, meaning controlling these countries by controlling their money. And in the 1980s, or I'm sorry, the 60s to the 80s, there was this focus on developing nations, the LDCs. And in the 1980s, there was another new philosophy, this new ideologue at the World Bank, where they were really criticizing the neo-colonization, and it was even pointed out by the United Nations International Children's Fund that the policies of the World Bank were responsible for reduced health, nutritional, and educational levels for tens of millions of children in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. So the idea here is that I want you to understand that some of the criticism is absolutely deserved of the World Bank and the IMF, but that the IMF and the World Bank have also been evolving, and so it's important to keep our criticisms relevant to what's happening today. So here's some examples of some current projects. There was some microcredit lending in Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is after the war that happened there. In the Balkans, aid prevention, education of girls in Bangladesh, healthcare delivery in Mexico, helping East Timor rebuild after their independence, and helping India rebuild after an earthquake. Just a few examples. So, and this course is about globalization and the environment, but I really had to talk about all that other stuff about lending and global institutions, global monetary institutions. So then we come to this, that prior to 1990, the World Bank was really not concerned about the effects that projects had on the environment. But over the years, they've been integrating more of their environmental concerns. Have they gone far enough? In my mind, absolutely not. There's still a lot more that they can do. Perhaps we'll discuss that more later. But it's good to know that they have been considering environment and are beginning to act on this. So these criticisms have been economic colonialization, as we've discussed, about poorer states having a lot of debt, and that they then, when they owe more money to the more developed countries, that erodes their own sovereignty. And then as they have more debt, then they become even more impoverished. So the World Bank even has admitted to being part of the problem here. So what we're hoping to see is that trend is reversed. Other criticisms was support of the apartheid regime that was in South Africa, and then being influenced more by the United States. And then the thought is that the World Bank often acts in the interest of the corporations that are related to the United States. so that the goal really isn't to reduce poverty, but to wield power to influence LDCs and to advance United States political interest. So some of the loans then are really not for economic interest, but for strategic interest, meaning how you can control a country with basically your money so that you can get influence in one country over another. Hopefully that makes sense. So for an example of that would be money that we provided in Greece, for example, so that we could have military bases there, or money that we provided in Turkey so we could have military bases in there, so that we could keep an eye on what's happening in Russia. And then the World Bank has also funded large-scale projects that resulted in large-scale destruction of the tropics. And the tropics are basically recognized as being, quote-unquote, the lungs of the earth. We should not be destroying the tropics and destroying all these habitats, yet the World Bank's been funding projects that have resulted in this. So that's primarily building roads into the tropics, which then result in widespread deforestation. So the World Bank is somewhat of a U.S. or a Western economy tool for imposing economic policies that support Western interests. These are, again, concerns and criticisms. The free market reform policies can often be harmful to economic development and can be undermining national sovereignty, creating dependence on debt, not being able to pay the debt, and creating a culture of corruption in developing countries because many are ruled by dictators, and then the money that we lend is controlled by dictators. This was a huge criticism with the Philippines, for example, or lending to the Philippines. And then the other is this basically controlling controlling knowledge, right? So knowledge production is an asset to the bank, so they use this to for their own strategic purposes. So it's integral to what they're going to fund or how they're going to justify large capital projects, so they can manipulate information and data to support what they want to support. That's basically the concern here. And then this reliance on this one knowledge system, basically how the Western world thinks, then ignores cultural beliefs and knowledge that people have over their own regions and areas. There's been plenty of stories about how Western ideas have gone in to promote things like development of water resources in Africa that absolutely and miserably failed because they did not take into consideration the local geography and the culture of people who live there. So key conclusions with all this stuff is that global lending institutions are evolving. The key about them and how they're going to operate is their goals, and then the methods to achieve those goals, and then who the decision makers are. And then lastly, that these decision makers face questions, and so it's good for the markets. These could be economic markets that then question the decision makers. So when I'm talking about their stockholders, right? There are stockholder meetings and bondholder meetings where questions come from these people wanting to know how decisions are being made and what goals are. And this might very well be used someday. So other key conclusions is that despite the many criticisms of the World Bank, and I just went over a whole bunch of them, the World Bank's improved the quality of life in least developed countries by having supported better education, health, sanitation, clean drinking water, better infrastructure, agricultural development, although I'm still critical of the agricultural development in the tropics, for example. And that environmental protection has been improved, and enforcing regulations has improved, and governance has been improved by encouraging anti-corruption. What we need, and what's lacking in all of this, and here's your absolute key critical conclusion, is We need more focus and action to reduce threats to sustainability. So in other words, through economic development, it's just been about being able to extract more resources to produce more goods and consume more goods, all of which has led to more greenhouse gases, more exploitation of the environment, and more pollutants overall. So what the World Bank has not done enough of is to close open loops of consumption. So that's it for this topic, all right? I'll catch you with the next one. All the best. Later.